Hi, and welcome to a really special reading between the words today. I have Daniela with me. She's just has such a heart. She's an amazing cook, chef, I guess is a way to put it. But she's just a beautiful person. Daniela, thank you so much for being on my show today.
Oh, thank you, LS. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, and we're here to celebrate, you know, you I'm gonna pause right there because you haven't written just one book. You have other books that you have been the lead author on. You've helped other people with. One that the first one I was in was Behind Closed Doors, and
hmm
we'll talk about all of that in a little bit. But let the audience know a little bit about who you are.
Sure. Thank you, LS. Yes. So I'm Daniella Roman. I'm out of New Jersey. And, to know me is to know that I grew up in a real traditional Italian family. My dad was straight from Italy, a strict father with me anyway. And, but, all the traditional things going to my grandmother's house and, family, everything was around the table, right? And eating and things like that. So that's where I got my passion for cooking since I'm 8 years old, watching my grandmother and my mom. So that's a whole other story of where that led. But my dad, he was always just the most influential person in my life. He came from Italy, 14 years old, and you know just barely finished eighth grade and went right to work. And that's just how things were back then. So he just made a life for himself, and then, raised a family and made a life for my brother and I and my mom, and just always worked hard, but always shared these like life experiences that he had to help my brother and I with, our life and as we got older and things we experienced. So that's the main thing about him is just like the book says, big bear wisdoms. And I'll let you know how he got that little nickname in a little while.
Those that are watching the video, I'm going to hold the book up. She has hers on the table beside her,
Mhm.
but she has hers in her hand too. I am holding
Yeah.
up, getting as close as I can. This
Yeah.
is just a fabulous book. You can see it's not a big, huge, heirloom type book, but it
Yeah.
is an heirloom book. One thing I want to mention before we go any further is that anyone who has photos of their family, letters, stories, you don't know what to do with them, it's amazing to put them in a book. You don't have to do all of them, just pick a few that are important to you, write what's important about it, and now you have something to pass on to your family. And it's a wonderful thing to have. I love that you have so many photographs in there,
Mhm.
of passports and mainly you have a ship's manifest. My ancestors, we don't
Mhm.
have it, whether it got a lot of times they get destroyed in the water, because they're on
Yeah.
ships, they get lost, they get burned, who knows what
Right.
happens to them. But it's really great that you have that, and I'm so glad. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about behind closed doors because you do
hmm
mention part of that in this book. So
Right.
give our audience a brief explanation of what behind closed doors is.
Sure. Well, that is a book series I started several years ago. I ended up doing three editions of that, and you were a part of, the last one of those that I did. And it's sharing stories of surviving domestic violence, which was my backstory. And I had shared that several years back in another anthology. And actually, Emilio, my husband, came up with the idea of, starting this book series and getting other women to share their stories of surviving domestic violence. And it's in order, of course, to help other women that are going through what you and I went through. You never know who you're going to impact, who's going to hear your story, how it's going to affect them. And so that is something that I did, my goodness, like I guess I started about 3 or 4 years ago. And like I said, there was three editions. And the last one you were in, you shared your story. And I know like a lot of the women, you were a little hesitant to do that. And it's understandable because that's a difficult, touchy subject to talk about, right? And especially if it was many, many years ago. Mine was like 30 plus
Yeah.
years ago. And I know yours went, a little bit farther back. But it's also we worry about what are other people going to think, right? Our family or certain people that hear this that didn't know, or if they did know, they don't expect you to put it out there like that. But I had to let go of all that because, we create this thing in our head, right? Like, oh, my mom. I was more worried about what my mom was going to say because she didn't know a lot of the things. And, it was the first time that she was hearing this. And when I gave her the first anthology I did, and she read it, I was a little scared. I'm like, what is she going to say? Because we come from like that kind of family, Italian families, like what happens at home stays at home, meaning, whatever you go through, you don't go and talk about.
That's
And,
right.
yeah, after she read it, she texted me after and she was like, why didn't you tell us? We would have helped you. That was
Oh,
it,
wow.
and it was like shocking because I thought, especially knowing my mom, that she would just kind of, I can't believe you put that out there, but it was nothing like that. So, I
Some
knew I was doing the right
parent
thing.
surprises, don't they?
Yeah.
Give me just a moment. For those that are seeing the video, my puppy has come through the door. I didn't get it last night.
Oh,
She's
that's
gnawing me up, so
okay.
I'll be right back, Joe. So while I went to shut the door, I went and grabbed the book. It's called Behind Closed Doors. Now, this is not
Mhm.
the only book I've done with you and your husband. We've
Right.
got, my brain just stopped. We've got,
Spiritual fitness,
yeah,
spiritual fitness survivor. Yeah.
right, right. And then the shark book. Everybody calls it the shark book. And
Born to risk. Yes.
yeah, Fortress. That one was a lot of fun. Uh,
Yeah.
but but I love what you've done with Big Bear Wisdom. Why did you write this book? I mean, you could have not written anything, but why this book in particular?
Well, like I share in the book, my dad and I had a very close relationship. I am your typical daddy's little girl, right? And it was just something that was on my heart for years, even before he got sick and, passed, that I had wanted to get it out. And I just never did, like we think we have all this time, and
Yes.
just, it just went. And, before I knew it, I was like, ah, so it was something I promised myself that I would do because he shared so much in my life that I just felt like it had to be put out there, it had to be shared, and the wisdoms and the things that he knew that you wouldn't even think someone that barely finished the eighth grade would know things and live his life the way he did. Nobody taught him like a lot of these things. He just taught himself, and learned from life experiences, and that's very
And,
valuable.
and he was the first one to come to America, right? It's not like he grew up here and
Right.
had these years. He was the one who brought your family here.
Yeah, yes. It was his brothers and his mom, my grandmother, who was actually born in Rhode Island and then went to
Oh,
Italy. And when she had her kids there, she was
okay.
actually born in Rhode Island, which was interesting. But then, went back to Italy and grew up there and then brought her, she came here with a couple of her sons. And then my grandfather and my dad came on the ship last. And,
Okay.
they all, reconnected here and in Philadelphia is where he ended up, growing up and meeting my mom and so forth.
Wow. Wow. So your dad was, I don't, how old was your dad when he came to America?
14.
He was 14. Okay, so he
Mhm.
came. So why did they come here? Did your grandmother miss being here, or was there other circumstances?
No, I think just especially, I mean, it's obviously the reason a lot of people even come here today, but especially back then, it was just for, everyone looked at America like, oh, the land of opportunity, and
Yes.
and they
Yeah.
just wanted to, have a better life, and just so they all came here and they all made their way. You learn the language, you find work,
Right.
you start a family, and yeah, and they all did, very well, and it was very different back then when you came here. It
Oh,
was
yes. Yes.
very you had to have everything, your shots, you had to have a sponsor, you had to know where you were going to live
Oh,
or
wow.
work. It was very
Oh,
different,
wow.
but yeah, they had to follow each thing that you had to. And even when you knew people, like my one uncle came here and stayed with what they call paisans in Italian, like, other Italian people. And you would
Okay.
think like, oh, they welcome you, like, but he had rules. You know what I mean? It's not like, hey, you show up and it's like you do whatever. They had rules. You had to, be a certain
Oh,
way,
wow.
follow a certain protocol. So it wasn't
Oh,
easy.
wow. Wow. That I did not know. That's crazy.
Oh
I
yeah.
remember one thing I was told by someone was that when they came to America, they wanted to become Americans. So they learned the language, they
Mhm.
became Americans. They lived the culture and they left, not that they left their identity of who they were and their heritage, but they left
Right.
how they behaved back then so they could become Americans. And this person said to me, I don't understand the people today who come to America and want America to be their country. It's like you come here because there's a reason you came here. There's
Right.
opportunities. There's a different lifestyle. You have so much more available here. You don't have like the cartels and some of the other things
Yeah.
around that were attacking you, at the time when they were talking with me. And I thought that was very interesting to think of it that way. And this is someone who did come to America when they were adults. And
Hmm.
so that was enlightening, and it's interesting to hear how you're talking about this culture that was there. That yes, you're America's, but we have a set of rules to follow. You wouldn't
Yeah.
expect that at all.
Right, right. And
Yeah.
when you come here, like my dad used to say, like he had his brothers and they were a little older. My dad was the baby of the family. He was the youngest, but he seemed to be the most that really adapted to the culture here. He loved rock and roll. He loved the food. He loved the cars. You know what I mean? In the 50s and
Nice.
60s, that was his,
Yeah.
and they all did. But my dad used to say, you have to, adjust to where you are, to your environment. So he learned, learn the language, the music. It's not like you come here and he saw a lot of his, other Italians that came here, they would stay with the way they were in Italy, like only listen
Right.
to Italian music and only, involve yourself with just other Italians. And he's like, no, he's like, he wasn't like that at all. He made friends with everybody and every kind of culture.
Nice.
He was just very open minded that way. He loved to learn, the
Yeah.
American culture, and you should. This is where you're going to live.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hmm.
I guess I identify with your dad in that way because I've only been to a couple of places outside of the US, but each time I went, I wanted to find out what the people were like. I wanted to find out what the culture, what do they do every day? How do
Hmm.
they live their lives? What is different about them, and all the unique things they do. And it's so interesting. In fact, the um when I was at Taiwan, the concierge at the hotel says,
Hmm.
you are a crazy white American woman. You never take a taxi. You walk everywhere. You want to be a part of our
Hmm.
culture. And and I thought, well, doesn't everybody? And it's like, no, they don't.
No.
They want to go shopping and they want things their way. And it's like,
Yeah.
you're here in a different culture. You get to learn all these new things. You get to see
Yeah.
things you never have back home and experience things. It was language was a barrier because I didn't speak the language. Um,
Hmm.
but what I ended up doing and this was quite a while ago, but I went to Google Translate and I
Uh-huh.
write in their language, which is like a Chinese dialect. It's not words like
Yeah.
Americans have. So I'm trying to write it like it has. And I take it to the concierge and I ask him, I told him what I was trying to write. And I go, is this right? And he looks like, goes, yes. How did you do that? And I go, well, I went to Google Translate. And
Uh,
but he adjusted a couple of things so they could really understand what I was talking about. Because there you buy your food every day. You don't have like a grocery store like we have that you go to.
right.
And their supermarket is more like clothing, and they do have prepackaged foods and things like that.
Hmm.
But most people go to the market to buy their food for that day. And so I was going to this market. I mean, they had green beans longer than this and carrots that long. It was just crazy the
Wow.
things they got. And I'm taking pictures of everything. They're looking at me like, what are you doing? This is our food.
Yeah.
That's food where you live. But
Not like that.
yeah, it was very, And so once I was able to explain to them, they're like, "Oh, okay, yeah." And what a difference! It was just like this barrier that was there was gone, and now we all connected together. So saying all
Hmm.
of that, I really resonate with your dad on that. That's just, I'm so glad he did that. And that had to be good for you growing up.
Yeah, yeah. We did things, always did things as a family, went to the Jersey Shore, went to the Poconos up in the mountains.
Oh,
He would,
nice.
my brother, he was like really big with baseball and stuff. So, we would go to his games and, just very Americanized things where a lot, I noticed, like even in my own family, like the fathers that were, you know, from Italy, they
Mhm.
didn't, not that they were good dads, but they just didn't
Yeah,
involve themselves that way, like really Americanize themselves in that way.
right,
It was more
right.
just work and, I take care of the family and, and that's it. And my dad was just very hands on. Like he would work all day. He was a bricklayer. That's hard work.
Okay.
Yeah. So, but he would
So my
still come
great
home and,
or my grandfather did.
oh,
My
yeah.
great grandfather he made bricks. And
Oh,
so when
wow.
my grandfather married my grandmother, he went into the brick building business, brick making
Ah.
business and stuff. That's interesting.
Yeah, yeah, hard work. But he would still
Yes.
come home and find time to, work around the house, always making a nice home for us and take time to play with
Right.
my brother and I and, take us to our grandmother's, wherever, like always something. So yeah, I had a really great childhood. I mean, I'm blessed.
That's awesome. I did too. It's really nice to do that. So I have a question for you, and I know that some of our audience is asking too. And this is a question that's been presented to me is if you had such an amazing childhood, how did you end up in a toxic relationship?
Hmm. Yeah, good question. I know, right? And I
Yeah, it's
say
like,
that I
because we didn't
yeah,
know there were
you
those kind of people out there that were normal looking. That's my
yeah. And thank you for asking that because I brought that up because my dad, the way I talk about him, he was just, the consummate, son, father, husband, everything. And you would think, and like they say, most daughters, look for their, the mate
Yeah.
that they want to be with to be like their father. And yeah, to get involved with that. And here's the thing, for me, it was kind of just low self-esteem and
Mm.
I left home at 18. And because I was so, I don't want to say sheltered, like they didn't let me out of the house, but
No,
it was
but we
like,
are sheltered.
yeah,
Yeah.
very protected. And I didn't, I wasn't allowed to go hang out or date or, anything like that. So by the time I left home, it's not that I didn't know life because, like I said, my dad would share a lot, but until you actually experience things, you don't
Right.
know. So I
Right.
was very trusting, very naive, and got
Mhm.
involved with this person who was, Italian. And I'm like, oh yeah, my parents will love him. He's 100% Italian, and all that. Um, and just kind of got sucked in. And then once you're in it, as you probably know, it's very hard to get out because they mentally, they attack you mentally and make you think that you can't do better, or even if threatening. And this one was very like a very threatening and
Oh,
manipulative relationship. And I mean, I would be followed, and kind of pushed off the road while I'm driving and have
yeah,
people
I
follow
read
me.
that. That was just
Yeah.
to be terrifying.
Yeah, it was just very, unexpected. And like I said, I was young. I didn't, and here's the other thing. The way I grew up, I watched my dad, like whatever he went through or dealt with, any challenges, he took care of it on his own, right? He didn't go
Yeah.
to his
Well,
parents. He
we
didn't,
take
yeah,
care
he
of it
didn't
on
ask.
our own too, right?
Right. So I'm like, yeah, and that's the last thing I wanted to go back and tell my parents that I was dealing with. Number
Yeah.
one, my dad would probably end up in jail. If they knew
Yeah.
what was happening, that wouldn't have ended well. And number two was just very embarrassing, and just
Yeah.
how do I tell them that? So I didn't see them as close as I was to them. I didn't see them sometimes for months when I was going through
Wow.
this. Yeah, and I just
Did
would
they
make
ask what
excuses.
happened to you? Did they wonder why you weren't showing up?
Yeah, I would just always make excuses. I'm working
Wow.
or I'm doing this and that, just you just learn to make excuses. And when I did go, the one time I remember I had gotten really skinny and and
Yeah.
he thought I was sick. he literally thought I had like a disease. That's how like I looked, and I
Yeah,
just, of course, just had to, you just keep making up things. My dad's not dumb, but they just
yeah,
didn't really know that that's exactly what was going on, and never did know until I wrote for the first time a few years ago,
yeah.
about it. So,
Was
but how
that
do
a
I end
real
up with?
shock to them?
I'm sorry.
Was that a real shock to them? I know what you said about your mom that she couldn't believe it. Was your dad still around? Was he able
Yeah,
to?
yeah.
Yeah,
You know what? He didn't really say anything. I think he kind of left that to my mom. I don't know if he even knew how to approach that, especially since it was
yeah.
so long ago by the time this came out. So him and I honestly never even talked about it. Never
Wasn't
even
that
talked.
something?
Yeah, but I'm sure,
Yeah.
I can imagine that it affected him, but he didn't say anything. And my mom, like I said, and here's the thing. I said to her, I said, look, I'm fine, because she was like, you should have came to us and we would have helped you. I said, yeah, I said, I'm fine. I dealt with it. It was a long time ago. But what I had to realize was I had 30 years to get over it and process it, but she was hearing it for the first time.
Oh, yeah,
So
yeah,
I had to let her kind of process that. So, I mean, it doesn't matter how old your kids are, you know what I mean? When you hear something like that, it's,
yeah. Your
you go
kids are
into,
always your kids.
yeah,
It's,
yeah. So that you want to
regardless of
protect
mom.
them.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Um,
Hmm.
so I don't know about you, but I know for myself, even though I didn't wait that many years to get married again, but
Hmm.
I was scared to date anybody. I didn't know if I could trust myself to choose because I didn't make the right choice the first time.
Right.
Is that difficult for you too? How did that process kind of go? I know this
Well,
kind of gets away from the book. You do mention it in the book, but
oh, yeah, yeah.
just
No,
if you
well,
don't mind.
honestly, I went from bad to worse because I ended up in another abusive relationship.
Oh,
Yeah,
wow.
I ended up in
Yeah.
two.
And that's really common.
Yeah, yeah. And, it was, I guess number one, I didn't give myself enough time from the
Mhm.
first. I didn't even heal from the first or deal
Right.
with, all of that, and then met this person, and that went on for over 4 years, and that was a
Wow.
difficult thing to, get out of. And then finally, I just I'm sure, as you get to a point where it's like, years go by, you mature, you grow, you learn
Mhm.
things, and you're like, what am I doing? And then you just kind of get a little tougher skin, and you don't tolerate, just don't
Yeah.
tolerate that kind of, anything anymore. And, you know, uh, fortunately I moved on, and I was married for 22 years to someone, and was, a great person, and was great to my son, and everything. That ended for different reasons, nothing bad that he did or anything like that. But, I finally knew what a healthy relationship was, you
Right.
know. You look back and it's like, oof, I'll never do that again. You learn. And again,
Yeah.
it has a lot to do with I was young, naive, like I said, and didn't have the
Yeah.
experience, and it happens. And you would think, like you said, why do we end up with
Yeah.
someone that's totally opposite of our father?
Yeah.
You know.
And you bring up a really good point too. And I heard this before when I was going through my divorce is that the second person you meet is like the first person, and the reason is because that's what you know. That's
Mm-hmm.
what's comfortable. They may present themselves differently and in different ways, so you don't
Mm-hmm.
really know. Sometimes you do know, and you just do it anyways because you think, oh, it can't be real. It really can't happen the second time, but it's real normal. That's why it's
Right.
really good to get the counseling, to get help, to talk to people, to find out, what do you think about this person? And most
Mm-hmm.
your, the people that are close to you will say, he's a nice guy, but I don't know. There's just sometimes there's just little things that seem a little bit off.
Yeah.
But then you met Emilio. You don't really go into that story in the book. You talk
Mm-hmm.
about him, and then later on you talk about you and Emilio moving to a new place. But how did that, if you don't mind telling us, how did that
Yeah.
happen?
Well, it's funny because him and we went to high school together.
Oh,
And yeah, so back in the 80s, we went to high school together. But then, like 28 years went by, like we graduated high school and 28 years he lived his life, I lived mine. And then 8 years ago through social media, of course, is how we reconnected.
Isn't
And
that
I had
something?
not, yeah, I had not seen that name in 28 years. And I'm like, I saw him comment on a mutual friend's post. And I'm like, wow, Emilio Ro, I have not seen that name. And here's the funny thing, I had a crush on him all through high school and he never knew it.
Oh, really? Oh, wow.
Yep. And you know what? Like going back to how my dad was, it wouldn't have mattered if he knew because I wasn't allowed to date or anything like that. So,
Yeah.
no point in him
Yeah.
knowing. So we kind of connected, in messaging or whatever. And he's just like, hey, how you doing? And I was going through a divorce at that time.
Okay.
And we just kind of, went back and forth. And then we met up in person because we lived in the same area, actually. And the rest is history, as I say, we just
Nice.
connected, and his energy. So, it was
Oh, yeah.
very,
Great
yeah, it
energy.
drew me in because it was opposite of what I had. Like I said, my 22-year marriage, he was a good guy and everything, but it was just a totally different culture and different personality.
Oh,
And
yeah.
this,
Yeah.
I guess, how Emilio is what I needed at the time.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good. Yeah. Now, you did mention in the book, let me think of it. I just thought of it a second ago. Let's see if I can remember. Um, you mentioned about how Emilio had mentioned to you about some of his trauma.
Mm,
Um, and then that lets you open up to your trauma.
right.
And that had to be healing for both of you, I would think. Were you already married? I haven't quite finished this part. I was just kind of looking at some of the stuff I hadn't read yet, and it's like, oh, that's
Hmm.
a good point. But was this before you were married that you talked about this, or was it after you were married?
After I married Emilio, you mean that he brought that up?
Yeah, is that when, or was it before?
It was actually before we were married, and we were
Okay.
having a conversation, and he shared because a little backstory, I had not shared with anyone in 30
Okay.
years, even my ex, who I was with for 22 years. He
Yeah.
knew that I was in the first abusive relationship a little bit, but the sexual assault in my sleep when I was 19, I never shared that with anyone
Oh,
in
wow.
30 years. And that manifested into, anxiety, depression, eating disorder, suicide, all these things over the
Yes.
years that I was like, why am I going through this? Because when you bury things, you just, they're so deep down, you don't even remember yourself, right?
Yeah,
And then,
but they definitely affect you. You know,
yeah, they
they keep
manifest.
trying to pop up whether you know that that's what's going on or not. Yeah.
Exactly. And I didn't know what was going on. And I'm like, what is happening? So then by the time I was with Emilio and we were just talking one day and he shared some of his childhood traumas and things he went through. And what he did was he wrote a letter, literally wrote it out and to this person that hurt him and said, I forgive you. And, just laid it out in a letter of what he felt like
Wow.
and dropped it off to this person.
Oh, he
Now,
did.
yeah.
Wow.
So, and that's pretty powerful. Now, the person that, sexually assaulted me, I don't know if he was dead, alive, I don't know where he was, but Emilio encouraged me. He's like, just write out what you would say to him because it's powerful to get things out on paper and
Yeah.
just get it out of your head and put it on paper. So I did that and I said, I forgive you. No matter what, I just put how it made me feel, what happened, how it affected my life. But in the end, I forgive you. And I just kind of let it go after that. It was like such a release just to do
Yeah.
that. So he taught me that, forgiveness, as we know, is not for the other person, it's for us.
Right.
So the more
Right.
we just hang on to resentment and being angry about what happened or whatever, the other person has gone on with their life, probably not even giving a second thought about what they did
Oh,
to you.
yeah.
And
Yeah.
we're the ones suffering, holding on to this all these years, and it's affecting our life, whether it's addiction. With Emilio, he's very open. It caused him to be, an alcoholic and drugs and this and that, all because of what happened
Right.
to him as a child.
Right.
But once he let that go, and not that he didn't still struggle for some years, but so after doing that and releasing that, that's when my healing, I feel, began.
Oh,
Yeah.
nice. Nice. it is true. One thing I did, I guess I've always been a writer, but
Hmm.
I just didn't do anything with it. But one thing I would do when there would be tough things is I had a notebook that I wrote in and I would write the story. But I would write the story in a happy, I never told about the awful stuff that I turned the story
Hmm.
into something really fun and positive.
Hmm.
And years later, after it was all gone and I was unpacking things and I read it and I was just, my jaw dropped open. I was appalled that I wrote something and I never told what really happened. It's like I
Hmm.
got angry at myself for lying and not telling the truth. Um,
Right.
they were probably really great stories. I probably should have kept them, but I says, no, I don't want anybody to read this because it's full of lies. But that was
Mm.
how I dealt with it at the time. That's how I was able to cope with it. And yeah, writing stuff down really does make a difference. It's powerful. We talk about it in mindset, manifesting, all of those things is writing it down. Now you talked about forgiveness. Now, if someone comes to us and asks our forgiveness, that kind of forgiveness is not for us. That is for them. But
Right.
we too, if we're able to forgive them, we get such a tremendous healing that's there. I remember Corey Ten Boom. She was talking about one time when and I know I'm showing my age here. She wrote the book The Hiding Place,
Okay.
about how they hid Jews in their home when
Mm.
Hitler was trying to kill all the Jews and all of this. And there's a
Mhm.
whole story to that. We're just doing brief synopsis right here. But she says went to a talk one time, and up from the back comes this guy walking to her. And when he sees her, or when she
Mhm.
sees him, something's triggering that this is not a good situation. And he says, Corey, says what his name. And right away she knew he was one of the guards who would beat his sister, who would beat the other one, who was not good. I mean, these women would have to stand naked 3 o'clock in the morning in Germany in the snow and all of this. I mean, torturous things that were going on. And he reaches his hand out and says, I want to ask your forgiveness. And she right away, she's like, well, I don't think so. Um,
Mm.
she just, that instant struggle of,
Yeah.
but if I'm talking about God's love and God forgives, how can I not do that? Because
Yeah.
I see God lives in me. And she said she reached her hand out, even though she didn't want to. She reached her hand out. And she said, God, you're going to help me through this. As soon as she shook his head, she just felt this power flow through her, just this immense love. And she
Wow.
says, I forgive you. And I mean, for her, that was a big healing moment. And what a powerful story, a real life story to talk
Yeah.
about forgiving someone who did such horrendous things to us. And,
Mm.
you know, we
Hmm.
never know what we're capable of doing until that moment. Sometimes we say, well, if I ever see that person, I'm going to do this. But you never know until
Right.
that moment you're there. What actually, even then you don't know. You just either react or act. And
Hmm.
sometimes we surprise ourselves. So we've
Yeah.
talked a lot about not the book. We have in a ways
Okay.
because some of these things are in there, they're mentioned,
Yeah.
and people want to know the backstory. And that's
Hmm.
part of reading between the words is we get to hear the story behind the story. So tell us a
Right.
little bit more about what your dad gave to you, this closeness you had with him, these nuggets of wisdom he's given you throughout his life. Tell us about that part.
Sure. Well, growing up, like I said, he would always share his life experiences. He'll tell a story like, oh, and where he got a lot of these was really funny. When he was growing up in Italy, he would always say, it's like whether it was his grandmother or a neighbor or an uncle, they would share these little quotes. And,
Wow.
yeah, then if you go through the book, just about like the beginning, I think of every chapter, there's one of these like quotes. Um, and it's funny because throughout the years you'll hear uh let's say Tony Robbins or Zig Ziglar, whoever, they have these things, yep, um they have these quotes like, like for instance, we become the average of the 5 people you hang out with, right? We always hear like whoever one of these mentors, whoever had said, say that, meaning, if you're hanging with somebody who's a drinker, you're going to become a drinker, or you're going to, hang with somebody who gets in trouble, you're going to get. My dad was, used to tell me and my brother that since we're little. He's like, be careful who you hang out with because that's what you're going to become, So I would hear these things he shared with me. And then later in years, like more when I got with Emilio in the self-development space, and you hear all these things. And I'm like, my dad said that years ago. And he didn't know Tony
Yes.
Robbins from a hole in the wall. I can guarantee you that. He didn't know. He didn't know Zig Ziglar. He didn't know who these people are.
Oh,
So
yeah.
it's just, yeah, wisdoms that are passed down from like
Yes,
generations. And
I love that.
we all just kind of put our own spin on them, and they all
Yeah.
mean the same. Like I love this one. He says, you have to bend a tree when it's small so it grows the direction you want it to. So he used to tell my brother and I, when you're raising kids, for instance, right?
Yeah.
And you see a lot of parents, even today, it's like 16, 15 years old, they're having issues with oh my God, they don't listen and they're doing this, they're doing that. My dad, and that's when the parents are like, trying to be strict with them. And my dad's like, you got to do that when
Oh,
they're little,
little. Yeah.
because when they're small, you can help which way they go. Just like if you plant a tree this big, you want it to grow this way, you can bend it that way, and that's the way it's going to
Yeah.
grow, or the other way. And that's the same thing with, raising kids. You have to start when they're little. You don't wait till they're 16 to teach them respect,
Oh,
you
because
know?
they learned when they're little, they don't have to respect.
Exactly. So
Yeah.
things like that. He had so many, like, nobody's going to tell you to wash your face so you look better than them.
I was just reading that. That's the
There
one
were
I used to read. I
you?
loved it. Yeah.
That's one of his,
That one's
that's one of the
good.
best ones. Meaning some people unfortunately don't want to see you do well. They're not gonna, they
Oh,
don't want to
yeah.
tell you, hey, do this to make yourself better. They want to see you fail. So my
Yeah.
dad was big with that, like, be careful who you're hanging with, you
Yeah.
know?
That's
Yeah, he just
awesome.
had like a quote or a wisdom or an answer for everything.
Yeah.
He really did. And he was so funny and quick witted. There's in here, I think it's my son's chapter, when his my ex, he would like have a couple glasses of wine with my dad or whatever. And he used to, like, my dad never would go overboard. He only drank a glass of wine or two with a meal. He was not like,
Okay.
oh, let me just drink the drink. He always said, don't ever do that. Just always have food if you're gonna have a glass of
Oh,
wine or a
good.
drink. Yeah, he was not a drinker. So my ex, he was like, "Oh, come on, Big Bear, have another one." He's like, "Life's too short." And my dad's like, "Yeah, life's short, but we don't have to make it shorter." You know what I
You
mean?
know, I love that.
That is so funny.
Oh,
Like, meaning,
yeah.
don't help it along by, overdoing
Yeah.
something that's not good for you. It's he always had things like that. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. I love that you could laugh. That's one thing that I loved with my family. And my dad, his family was not full of laughter. His home was not
Mm,
full of that kind of love and laughter and just building each other up. So when he got to my mom, he loved her family. I mean, because
mm,
every time we got together, we were laughing, we were happy, we were joyful. It was just amazing. Now,
mm-hmm,
my parents both came from Nebraska, but my grandparents were in Idaho. So
mm,
my naive little me, not understanding how it all works, I thought all the family back in Nebraska was my dad's, and all the
right.
family in Idaho was my mom's. I didn't
Mm-hmm,
think about great grandparents and great uncles and great aunts, things like that.
mm-hmm,
When we would go back to Nebraska, we would also see some of my mom's family. And so I remember the first time we went there, and I was a very tiny person, very small. Um,
mm-hmm,
and and we went over to this one people's house, and I loved it. You see, all of my mom's family, they're all 6'4", 6'2", really
oh, wow.
tall guys. And, even my aunts were fairly tall. My mom, I think she was like 5'8", something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So we go to this one family, which was actually my mom's mother's. My grandmother on my mom's side, her family, they were short like me, and they
Mm-hmm.
laughed and they sang and they joked with each other, and it's like
Mm-hmm.
these are my people.
Yeah. Oh,
It was
that's funny. That's funny you say that because that was like how my mom and my dad's found. Now my mom, I don't even know her family.
oh
There's that's a whole
wow.
story. Yeah, she
Yeah.
has not seen her family in 50 plus years since she married my dad. And that's another whole story. So she grew
Wow.
up different. You know, her
Yeah.
dad was an alcoholic. Then they got divorced. So it was a broken family. But when she got with my dad, it opened up like just like you, like a whole new thing, like Italians around. And she grew up around a lot of Italians, so she was kind of
Yeah.
used to that. But it just they brought her into the family, like like it didn't even matter. She wasn't. My mom's not Italian. You would
Yeah.
think she is, but my dad used to say she's more Italian than I am. The stuff
Oh
that
wow.
she knows and the way that she cooks and all that. So that was just amazing for her because they welcomed her like their own and loved
Oh
her. And
wonderful.
so she had the family that she didn't really grow up with. You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
yeah, it's
Yeah.
really nice that you can at least you get a spouse, you choose a spouse that gives you what was missing, and she always
Yes.
had that for so many years, like with her, my grandparents and my aunts, my uncles, all of them. It was, they just loved her. They really did.
That's awesome. So what is the one thing you really want a reader to get out of the book when they read it?
I want them to see that no matter where you come from, no matter the circumstances, the struggle, if you grow up without, you don't have to grow up with money and lavish things, that you can achieve anything you want. It's about hard work and no excuses. That was my dad's thing. There's no excuse not to do anything. And like I said, he came here, his siblings came here, and didn't know the language. They learned the language. They barely finished eighth, ninth grade, some of them,
Yeah.
but they made a life. They made it work. They didn't, depend on the system or other people. You got to work hard and, for what you want. I want people to see that. Like today, you have every opportunity. There's really no excuse not to
Yeah.
do or be successful in today's world because he came here in 1955. We're in 2025. If
Isn't that
he made a
crazy?
life for him, yeah, if he made a life for himself and did what he did, there's just so much opportunity today. And the only excuse would be is you. My dad had a Italian saying, it sounds nice in Italian, but he would say, there's no defect in this life unless there's something wrong with you.
Yes.
So there's
Yeah.
no excuse not to do anything. It's you that's stopping
Yep.
yourself from doing anything. So I want people to see, you know what I mean? Doesn't matter. There's no excuse for anything. Doesn't matter your economic background, your father's in your life, he's not in your life, your mom's an alcoholic, whatever it is. You have choices. You make a choice to, how you want your life to go.
One thing I really like about this book, and you may not even realize that it's there, is that people that grew up in homes that where they didn't have a great childhood, that they maybe are in a relationship that's not good,
Mm-hmm.
and they need to know what normal looks like. And your book provides that. Your book
Mm-hmm.
provides what a and I don't want to say normal, but a family that enjoys each other, that takes care of each
Mm-hmm.
other, that looks out for each other. This is
Right.
a great example of that. This is something they can take and read and say, there might be something that says, I really want that for my family. Well, here's an
Mm-hmm.
example for it.
Yeah.
And I love that because there's a lot of self-help books out there. There's a lot of what you should do or what you shouldn't do and all of
Mm-hmm.
this, but here you have a great example of what it really looks like, of
Mm-hmm.
how to live in that hope and that joy and keep going forward, even though something happens. Now you do talk about in the back, and I haven't read the last few pages, so it's okay.
That's
Little
okay.
spoiler alert here or something, but you talk about your dad's decline, about depression, him being sad. That
Mm.
had to be tough to go through yourself, but what was really going on with him? If we can say that without really ruining it for our readers.
Oh yeah, yeah. Well, come to find out that my grandmother, I remember many years ago, she battled depression, And I wrote in the beginning, if you remember, she had lost 3 kids.
Yes, yes.
So if you know, like back in those days, right? It was more like it's
Yeah,
not like today, you have counseling, you get help, you have all this support.
yeah.
Back then it was about survival. It was like, hey, we just keep moving and we got a family
Mhm.
to raise and so I really believe that she just buried all that. Can imagine like she had
Yeah,
2 kids that were actually born. Like I believe the one, Mario, he was at least a year old or so, and whatever the situation was, he passed, and then there was a little girl, and then I believe the other one was a miscarriage. So I can't even
right.
imagine. I know, we know people that have lost one child and it was
Mhm.
devastating. Imagine 3 and never really dealing with that and healing from that. And I believe that manifested, like we were talking earlier, you don't deal with things, it will manifest into, worse things. So she
Yeah,
battled depression, and I believe my dad, he was a lot like my grandmother, because she worried about everybody, and she was always, that one, just worry about everyone. My dad was the same way. And my
isn't
mom
that
used to tell
something?
him, "You're just like your mother." And because he was the closest to his mom. He was the closest.
Yeah.
That woman, they all of course loved her, but he did everything for his parents. He was the baby, but you would think he was the oldest, the responsibility that
Wow.
he
Isn't
always,
that something?
stepped up. So yeah, that was very difficult to watch my dad go through that. And if you read, I mean, I was seeing things with him. Like we talk every day, sometimes 2, 3 times a day. He wouldn't even call me. He wouldn't even get on the phone if I called. He wouldn't answer his
Oh,
phone. That was like, I'm like, wow, what is going on? And my mom, it was very difficult for her to deal with that. He's just laying on it. You would never, ever see my dad laying on the couch.
yeah.
Never. Especially if somebody comes over, you
Yeah.
know? And he was just, I mean, he was
Oh,
really in a
wow.
bad depression. It was really sad. He wouldn't eat. He was, and it led up to, he lost his oldest brother a year prior. And we realized it was coming up on the 1 year anniversary of that,
Mm,
that he got like this. And I believe that that's what triggered it.
right.
But he
Right.
always just kind of had that tendency for depression, and he went through anxiety. He went through all this stuff. And again, if you read, he went through a traumatic accident when he was 38 years old. He fell 4 stories. And, that
Oh
I believe
my.
he had, yeah, off of the scaffolding on a construction job. And he, I believe that, traumatized him, gave him PTSD in some form. And,
Yeah.
again, these old school people, they don't go to counseling and deal with these things. They
And you
just
don't
keep
talk to your
moving.
buddies about it. You keep
No,
it inside
no.
and you just keep going.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
all that will eventually come out in other ways. So yeah, that was very
Yes.
difficult for all of us. And then thankfully, they found the right medication to get him through that, and he
Oh,
got past
good.
that. But yeah, that was tough. It
Isn't
was
that
really,
something? That would be really hard. Um,
yeah.
and and so, there comes a time when our parents have to go home, I'll say.
Hmm.
And that had to be pretty tough to go through.
Yeah. That was like, whew, the hardest day of my life. Yeah. For
Yeah.
all of us,
Yeah.
because he was the, like they say, the patriarch of the family, and
Yeah.
my son especially. I mean, my son is a lot like me. Since he's little, like he holds things in, he doesn't
Yeah.
express. And
Mm.
I share in the book that day that we were all there and my dad took his last breath, my son hugged me and he just let it out like I've never
Oh,
seen.
good.
He was 30 years old at the time, and you know what?
Wow.
Never in my life did I see him show emotion like that, and he just,
Isn't that
because,
something?
it was like probably well, it is his first real big loss in his life.
Yes. I'm glad he
So
felt safe enough to do that with you.
yeah.
And
Yeah, oh,
that's
yeah, I was glad he did.
amazing.
And
Yeah.
what's funny is, as close as I was with my dad and how devastating this was, I didn't cry at that time.
Yeah.
And, my
You
mom,
were
she,
there
of
for
course,
the others. That's
I
why.
think, yeah,
Yeah.
I think so. Even Emilio said to me, he's like, "You're
Yeah.
really doing well." And I'm like, mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I'm trying. It was tough. But the next morning when I woke up, and the first thought that I had in my mind was that, like, my dad's gone. And it just like came out,
Yeah.
And
But
yeah,
so.
It's been tough. I have to say, it's 2 years now, and I can't even believe we just talked about it the other day. I'm like, wow. Sometimes I even like I'm driving and I'm like thinking, I have to remind myself. I'm like, yeah, he's really gone. Like we don't. It's hard to accept because we think certain people are just they're here forever. And
Yeah,
and
I
it's
that was
hard.
with my mom. In fact, it was probably a couple of years after she was gone. I actually picked up the phone and started to call her, and it's like, what am I doing?
Well,
It was
two Father's
because
Day,
I
LS. Two
yeah.
Father's Day. I went past in Walmart the Father's Day cards, and I'm like, ooh, and I literally had to stop.
Oh
Like I'm
yeah,
ready to
that's
buy a
tough.
Father's Day card. Yeah, and it's just like
It's
you
like,
your
okay,
mind.
I'll give this to my kids. Maybe
Yeah,
it's appropriate. So
right.
like, Mom, I love you. You're my mother.
Yeah,
I do. I
yeah.
do Mother's Day cards for my kids and and Father's Day cards for my son. Um,
Hmm. Yeah,
but
it's tough. It's
yeah,
it's hard to adjust. It really is. Even
yes.
after years go by, it's tough. It is.
Yeah, especially when you're close like that, and I did with my mom, called her all the time,
Oh
especially
yeah.
with genealogy, family stuff, because my mom was so smart. She remembered everything. She remembered the names, the dates, and then
Mm.
she had her strokes, and she finally had enough strokes that she started getting dementia, and
Uh,
it was really weird. My sister and I talk about this quite a bit. It was so strange to see this alien from Mars, I guess, live in our mother's body because
yeah.
it wasn't our mom. But she took care of us when we were little through all the stuff we went through our toxic
Mhm.
relationships. So we took care of her. But
Right.
it's still tough. It's tough to go through all of that.
It
Dan,
is because yeah, dementia was part of my dad. My dad had Parkinson's, and dementia is
oh
part of
yeah,
that.
that's hard.
So
Yeah.
yeah, we dealt with that too. It's tough to see somebody that was so on the ball, and you know what I mean, and
Yeah.
just not
Just be
remember
so
things.
different. Yeah. Yeah, definitely. My dad, when he started getting Alzheimer's,
Mm,
he said to me one time, he goes, I don't understand why I can't say the word that I'm trying to say. And
mm,
I felt for him because he knew he was struggling and he
yeah,
knew he couldn't do anything about it. He tried so hard. And
yeah,
that's a tough one. That's a tough
yeah.
one
It
to go
is.
through. So, Daniela, thank you so much for this amazing book.
Oh,
I
thank you.
treasure it so dearly, and I am going to finish reading it. But I love
Yeah.
the colors. I love the picture of your dad on the front. And I thank you for sharing so many vulnerable moments in the book too, and but sharing the photos of your family. I mean, this is just a book. You just get hugged with this book and you feel involved, and it's just wonderful. So thank you for being here on the show. Oh, we have to let everybody know where to get the book.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So you know what? You can reach out to me. If you're on Facebook, you can just, message me, Daniela Roman, or go to info at danielasdeliciousdelights.com, my email, and just, uh, let me know if you want a copy, and I will sign it and mail it off to you.
And also know you mentioned this Daniela's Delicious Delights. I love your cooking. I am so glad that you are doing the cooking, that you're doing it for others, that you're making a
Yeah.
business out of it, and I wish you the best in that. I wish you
Thank
the
you.
best with this book and all of your life, and I can hardly wait till we get to do something again and I get to
I
see you
know.
again.
I know. I would love to see you again. Yes, LS. Thank you so much. This has been great.
Oh,
Thank you for having me.
definitely. Oh, thank you so much for coming on, and we'll see you next time on Reading Between the Words.
Thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time on Reading Between the Words.